Hello everyone, properly this time. Welcome to GlasgowJS March edition. It's a beautiful day. It's so nice to see everyone here. We have some fun news for this month. CityJS have extended to us a ticket, which is a conference in London at the end of April. So if anyone wants to sign up for the prize draw, which Jamie's going to be pulling at the end of next week, you may have noticed the swaggy banner at the front by the door. There's a QR code on there. If you scan that, you can sign up to the newsletter or you can sign up to the Discord server, where Jamie will be sharing a link. And you can sign up to that. You'll be up for a chance to go to London, which will be quite fun. Also, fun development. Thank you to all of our Patreon subscribers who can help fund our pizza. They help keep this whole thing going. And if any of you want to also sign up to the Patreon, you can find that on the Scottish Technology Club website, which similarly refer to the banner and the QR code. Admire the banner, it's very beautiful. Yes, so if you subscribe, we can get more banners, dozens of them hopefully, all the colours of the rainbow. I think that's it for housekeeping. Not much admin this time around, so I guess without further ado, we've got Sergio today who's going to talk to us about design systems and Tailwind.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So before we start, just to gauge a little bit, how many people have used design systems before? Cool. How many people have used Tailwind CSS? Great. That's great. Right, so today I'm going to be talking about design systems and Tailwind CSS. Cool. So what I'm going to be talking about is myself a little bit. Then I'm going to use a bit of a case study just to provide a little bit of context on why it is that I ended up using these tools, just like how they kind of fit in. After that is going to be a bit of an introduction to design systems. Then talk about Tailwind and how it ended up being a perfect tool to just implement them. And then just a little bit of a demo. I'm just going to show kind of like putting everything into an actual project, just because it's all very abstract. So I feel like it's useful just to kind of have something that is an actual thing. So I guess you might be wondering why someone would be talking about design and CSS in a JavaScript meetup. Just bear with me. It would all make sense eventually. The talk itself is aimed at developers. I feel like design systems are a really, really strong developer tool, as much as they are for designers. And we all need to do styling at some point, whether we want it or not. Even if we are building like a back-end sort of service and we just want to test what it is going to look on the front end, we still are going to need to do a little bit of styling. So might as well just, make it good somehow. But I do think that UI design and development are just two sides of the same coin. You can't really have one without the other. Worrying a little bit about design can make the implementation way, way easier over time. In bigger teams as well, if design and dev can speak the same language, it can just break down a lot of the friction, just make things a lot smoother. And at the end of the day, it just lets you build cool stuff, which is what I think we all should be striving for. Before that, let's talk about dinosaurs for a little bit. Those are my favorite ones. They're really nice. But I'm not just talking about dinosaurs for no reason. I do think that dinosaurs can be great teachers. And I feel like they should serve as a bit of foreshadowing. There's 3 things that I feel like dinosaurs can teach us. The first one is that everyone is just trying to survive. We're all just trying to make it to the end of the day. We don't have any time to like get creative and like try to make up this great solution. We're all just trying to survive, really. And then through that survival acting, we start coming up with solutions, ways to make our life a little bit easier. And then that change is just the time from us trying to adapt. Sometimes you find a niche and you fill it in. You feel like, oh, this could be something I could do. And then you do that. The second one is that evolution has no purpose, no intention, and no direction. With hindsight, it looks like it was meant to be. You look at a bird and it's like, oh, it's a bird. It was meant to fly, but it's not really. Again, we're all just stumbling our way upon life. And then all these little kind of like small adaptations and small changes over time start piling up. And then, as I said, with hindsight, you look at it and it's like, oh yeah, this is like a huge change. But actually, if you just look at the sort of moment to moment, there's not really a lot of change. And then the third one is that similar pressures produce similar outcomes. So there's a concept in sort of paleontology and evolution and so on, is that called convergent evolution. And it's the idea that when you have similar environments and similar pressures, they produce similar outcomes. If you look at a shark and a dolphin, and they're quite similar, like they have a very similar body plan, even though they're not related to one another, but that's just because similar pressures will produce similar results. And an interesting side effect of that is that maybe something that doesn't look like the most efficient way to do something might actually be quite efficient. Subtle foreshadowing. And I think like that some of these ideas apply surprisingly well. So my story, my name is Sergio. I like designing stuff and building it. Most of my career so far has been doing front end and UI. I am from Spain, but I was born in Venezuela and I've been living in Scotland. June is going to be 10 years. That is depressing. And I've been in Glasgow for the last year, which has been amazing. And yes, dinosaurs are my special interest. So how did I end up in this pickle? How did I end up doing front end? The short answer is group projects. Kind of starting at uni, you don't really know what you're doing. You're barely learning the sort of like introduction to programming, and then you get thrown into group projects, and then people start saying, oh, I want to do this, I want to do APIs, and it's like, we're not going to do an API, we're just building a simple website, but never mind. And then turns out no one wanted to do front end, and I was like, all right, okay, I'll do it. But then that front end required some designing, and again, I was like, I'll just do that. Started doing that, and then kind of started enjoying it, liked it. I was even good at even. No, I wasn't. But I was kind of good at it, and you could say that I just found a niche. But then things get messy because turns out, unlike what I had been told, front end is not easy. There is loads of things to have in mind. There's loads of problems that we could go on and on and on and on for years. But I'm just going to focus on this sort of design-oriented stuff. So the main problem that I had was that going from my design board in Figma and then to my code editor and then to my browser, there were things that didn't make a lot of sense. Why does this thing look different? Like, it looks great on my design, but then the minute I try to like build it, it looks nothing like what I had been planning. A lot of the values felt inconsistent. It's like, well, what do I do? Do I put 23 pixels of padding in here, but then I have 25 pixels of padding in here? It's like, it's not making a lot of sense. Then it's like, as soon as you're trying to do responsive, anything responsive, you start building and you're like, okay, let's have a look at what the tablet is going to look like. And then you realize that you need to like start shrinking text. But then because of how CSS works, then you realize that that thing that you're shrinking down is actually shrinking down in more places, which just ends up being an absolute mess. Hex codes everywhere, one-off values everywhere. And in general, there was just a disconnect between my design and my code. Also a disconnect between my markup and my styling. I was having a look at a really old project today, and I have all my pages, sure enough, and then I have a look at my CSS file, and it was a 1,000-line CSS file where it was just a mess trying to look for anything. If you're trying to work on a feature, then you're like, you have all these different places where something could be affecting other things. So messy. And then naming things. Naming things is so hard. If you're building, say you're building a card, and in the card you have, yes?
Just watch you don't hit the mic when you're gesturing.
That's fine. That's right. I'll try not to. If you have say you have a card, and then in the card you have an image, and then you have a title, a piece of copy, and then you have like a link. And then you're like, sure enough, okay, so this is going to be a card. Okay, then I'm going to have the image. I need a div around the image. I'm going to name it container. Then you go to the text, and then the text itself has a container. But then you want the text to be, and that the text and the copy to be on top, and then you want the CTA to be at the bottom. But then, is this a container? So you end up having 3 different things named container, which doesn't feel very useful at that point. Might as well just not be naming things. And even if I was using variables for, even if I was using variables to keep track of my colors or my spacing, it still felt a bit odd. Kind of like, should I just name it blue, or should I name it primary, or what should this be named? So loads and loads of issues, and at this point I'm just trying to survive through a project. But it's okay, because slowly but surely, we can start working it out. We can't fix everything at once, but just slowly try to adapt, try to make little changes that will make our life a little bit easier. It looks obvious on the hindsight, all the things that you're doing, but then at the time you're not really seeing why you're doing things, you're just kind of just trying to make it. So some of the things I started doing was paid a bit more attention to my design, and then what that was going to look like on the browser. So like the actual resolutions of the mockouts, the spacing between objects, sizes, and then make sure that that was also happening on the browser. As I said, just trying to match the designs and the code. I feel like it's really easy when you're on your design board to just have like free roaming text pieces with like a button and an image, but nothing is really grouping them. When the reality of your code is that you're going to have loads of divs that are sort of dictating the structure. So why not just make it the same? If it has a div on the code, why not have a div on your design? Started using more variables throughout my styles, pixel values, text sizes, colors, whatnot, and then made my CSS more modular. So what I mean by that is that rather than have sort of one-off sort of CSS styles, why not, just in the same way that we encapsulate code in a function, why can't you just do the same thing with your CSS? So Sass is great at that. They have mixins that just enable that to happen. And so my components started then being a sort of mix of predefined styles or functions that just gave me, a flex box with everything centered, things like that. So I'll talk a little bit about the projects that I was working on that made me realize or put me in a position where I thought that design systems in Tailwind were really, really useful. So I already knew about design systems, and I knew a little bit about Tailwind, but it was not until I joined my previous job that I really started to put all these things into practice. So the company I was working at is called Mission 10. It's a small marketing agency based in Aberdeen. We also built software apart from the marketing. And I joined as a front-end dev. I ended up doing UI design as well, just because it worked out like that, kind of like during uni. A good chunk of what we were doing was marketing. We were also doing a few apps as well. But it's the marketing websites where this sort of came into place. So the first thing to have in mind is that the content was managed by marketing. It wasn't really managed by us. We were not really dictating what should be on the homepage. We're just getting told this is the block that we're going to need. Because of the nature of these types of projects, they are smaller projects. So rather than working on a product for about 2, 3, 4 X years, you worked on several projects over the span of a year, which is pretty cool because you have time to test and experiment and, oh, will this thing make my life easier? And then 3 months down the line, you realize that was a big mistake. But that's fine because on the next project, you just take what you learned and then apply it onto the next one. And then it was really, really heavily dependent on the branding because, again, we're talking about marketing websites for companies that have their own logos, they have their own needs, they have their own visual language. So that was another thing to have in mind. As for the tech, we mainly worked using PHP. On the apps that we're developing, we're using Laravel. But we did use Vue a few times, but didn't really go anywhere. And then on the marketing side, we're mainly using Craft CMS, which is really, really nice. It's just like a CMS using PHP. I think it's based on Symfony or something like that. Anyway, so we worked with Craft. That was really nice. We worked with WordPress, not so nice. And then with Expression Engine, which was not nice at all. Again, we're mainly building templates. So the focus on them was to make them flexible when you're making a website, you're kind of gauging with the content, like, oh, if I'm only going to have 2 lines of copy, then I could make the text a bit bigger. But because there were templates, it was like, no, I need to play it safe. And even then, it was surprising how often we had requests from marketing saying, oh, actually, we need to put 4 paragraphs of text on this little section. Could you update it? Which was painful. And then more, sorry, I need to slow down a little bit. When I joined, they were mainly using Bootstrap for the styling. They were starting to use Tailwind. So one of my first sort of project was to say, can you figure out how to use Tailwind in the best way possible, which is kind of why I ended up doing all this. We also use Webpack and Laravel Mix to bundle our assets, jQuery for all the interactive parts, and then the structure was mainly partial. So what that means is that we're not reusing code. We were more like just typing the same code over and over. So code repetition was everywhere. If you wanted to update one thing in one site, you had to update it into 100 other sites, which gets really messy very quickly. But as he said, project after project, you try new things, and then you're like, okay, this is working, this isn't. By the time I left, we were using full-on Tailwind for every single project. We're using Vite, which is a pretty amazing tool. We're using Alpine for interaction. So Alpine is like a really small JavaScript library. It's kind of the closest you can get to Vue without actually using a JavaScript framework. It's really, really nice. And then again, our mentality changed from partials to components. So try and reuse code as much as we could. Just try not to have that code being repeated everywhere. But there were a few problems. So the first one is visual inconsistency. We had other 2 developers working on the website, and then we're also using UI libraries, which they're very helpful because they make your life a lot easier, but then you end up having this issue where you can really tell that 2 different people have been working because things just look a bit off, and then you can really, really tell that different UI libraries have been used because the components look slightly different. One example that still haunts me is, as we'll see later, Tailwind offers a lot of defaults, and they offer a lot of defaults when it comes to colors. But they have 5 different neutral palettes. So they have gray, neutral, zinc, slate, and another one? Stone, that's the one. Cheers. And stone. And I feel like stone was really obvious that it was a different one, but then the reality is that people were using all the different neutral palettes, and then you start looking at blocks and you're like, that gray is not the same as that gray. It's not obvious to most people, but then when you start noticing, you're like, oh God, and then you start doing like search on your code base, and then you realize that no one is using the same neutral palette. So that was an issue. Spacing as well, whatever. Then the next issue is that every project felt like reinventing the wheel. We were rebuilding every website from scratch. And at some point you realize, is this the best way to do things? Can't we just automate it a little bit? Just, copy paste code and make it work somehow. It just required massive rewrites, especially considering the branding of the companies. It was just not a fun time. And then personally, I wasn't too happy with the results. Clients were happy, which was always nice, but then you always have that sort of sense of self-pride of like, no, I don't like what I'm doing. But let's just jump into the rest of the thing. So, design systems are probably the thing that saved my mental sanity. But what are they? We have a really nice sort of description by the people at Figma. But I think the TLDR is a design system is just a set of standards and components used to build UIs. That's all they are. They sound really fancy, but all they are is just standards and components. They're just a way to find order in the madness. Potentially you could use every single color and every single font and every single set of spacing in your project, but then that is going to make it horrible to work on. It's not going to be very maintainable. It's going to become overwhelming because you need to keep track of all the different variations. So it's good to have a limit, just limit our options and define standards to manage the visual design on our interfaces. Once we have defined those standards, we can also start just building components. And just to be clear, you don't build your design system and then you start building your app. That is going to be an iterative process. You're going to build your design system as you're building the app. Initially, you're going to know for sure that you need colors and you need a typography, whatever. But you're going to keep coming back to it and adding more things. I've also heard the term design toolkit refer to smaller design systems. I'm just going to say design systems, but it's just one thing to note. So why I like them is it's a single source of truth. So there's no more digging through the mockups, looking at like all these one-off single values. And they cascade because say that I'm using a brand color and this brand color is blue. And so my website looks blue. Instead of just having to search and replace every single instance on my Figma board or whatever, I can just change it one place and then it cascades down. It also helps with visual consistency because just having those standards will mean that you will have. It's kind of like adding limits, which sounds like a bad thing, but actually it just ends up being a lot easier to work with. And visually, it was just going to look a lot better. It also speeds up development time. Building stuff becomes surprisingly easy when you don't have the decision paralysis of figuring out what things are supposed to look like as you're building them. You have, again, as I said earlier, unified design and dev. Everyone's speaking the same language. You can always refer back to your Figma board or your config or whatever. And then a bonus one is that you can get early client approval because before we used design systems, clients didn't really know what their website was going to look like until after we had built them. But if you can just get a few mockups together, get the branding and like these are the colors, these are the typography, and just get the client to look at it, that saves a lot of time potentially in the issue because they can go, oh, actually, this is not the color that we're using, or actually, this is not the font that we should be using, or we don't really like where this is going. And you can, just go back to your Figma file, update it, send it back until they're happy. But to do that, we need a bit of a structure. So as JavaScript developers, which I'm guessing the majority of these people are familiar with JavaScript frameworks, you do use components, and then those components are built with more components, and then those components are built with more components, and so on and so on. It's kind of the same with a design system. You're going to have layers where you have these sort of building blocks, and then they're going to be used to build bigger blocks and bigger blocks and bigger blocks until you have your entire user interface. So there is an article called Atomic Design, which is, to me, is like a Bible because it kind of set the blueprint of the rest of my work for years and years. In this article, the author uses terms like atoms, molecules, and things like it's very like chemistry based. Over time, I found other terms that, even though refer to the same thing, they just convey what's actually going on a lot easier. But basically, you have design tokens that are the sort of like most basic units of, again, your brand or your visual sort of identity. With that, you build components. So components are just like checkboxes, buttons, small things like that, really small interactive units. Then you build patterns. Patterns are just collection of all of these. And then blocks if you're working on marketing sites that are just, again, collections of patterns, components, and other design tokens. So as I said, a design token is the absolute smallest unit of visual identity that we can think of. The more obvious examples would be your colors, would be the fonts that you're using, would be the spacing units that you're using, but it can also include things like rounded corners, it can include things like shadows, grids, animations. It could even include copywriting, like the tone of voice of your brand. But the main three ones I'm going to talk about a little bit will be color, spacing, and typography, because I think those are the obvious ones. So for spacing, again, like it's a repeating thing that limiting our options is going to save us on a lot of hassle in the future. So with spacing, it's good to have a set of sort of valid, valid values that we're going to be using on our margins or paddings and spacing between items. The idea is that you don't have to choose whether this padding should be like 23, 24, 25 pixels. You always know that it's going to be 24, for example. It also becomes particularly useful when you're dealing with big sets of space. If the difference between 106 and 60 and 150 and 170, if you only have one of them, then you don't really have to think about what the spacing should be. It should be 160, for example. The way to build it is you take a sort of base unit. I usually use 4 because it works out pretty well because it's divisible by 2 and whatever, where you take a base unit and then you start multiplying it. The smaller the values are, the smaller the gaps between values will be. So like with 4 and 8 and 12 and 16 is just 4 times 2, 3, 4, 5. But then the bigger you get, the bigger the gaps. So I can't do math straight from my brain, but I'm pretty sure that between 80 and 96, there's still like another, 4 values in between. So you're not going to have like an 88 and a 92. You're just going to have 80, then 96, 128, and so on. Pro tip, if you're building anything and you're trying to make it look good and you don't know how much spacing you should add, just add too much space, like clearly too much space, and then start removing it. And you're probably going to get to like a reasonable set of spacing rather than starting from the bottom. And then you're just going to leave it at 5 pixels, and it's going to look a bit, a bit rubbish. Maybe not rubbish, but you could improve upon it. So for typography, it's similar to spacing. You should consider at least having a bit of a scale so that you can have a really obvious choice if a bit of text should be one size or the other. It's also good to limit how many fonts you have available. If you have more than 3 fonts, you should probably reconsider how many fonts you're actually using. Partly because it's going to have an impact on the performance of your application, but also just visually, it becomes overstimulating to have too many fonts at once. So 1 or 2 should do the trick. Even 1 is absolutely fine. As I said, then just have a scale for your type. Sorry. The other thing would be try not to use any sizes. If you're going to use your base, don't use anything below 16 pixels. 16 pixels should be good enough to read. If you go just below that, it's just going to become unreadable, especially on mobile. And then just remember that line height has a great impact. Your line height should be, if it's going to be a piece of text that is meant to be read, it should be at least 150% the size of the font. And then colors. I could do an entire talk just on colors alone. They can become really, really, really complex. At the very minimum, you should have one color for the background, one color for the text, and then if your brand has a specific color, then another color for the brand. From there, you can do whatever you want. Generally, I try to have one neutral palette that is going to be helpful at having a set of colors for light mode and a set of colors for dark mode. So you can have that sort of, it's kind of including dark mode within the initial stages of your design rather than being an afterthought. After that, if you have a brand and then you can see the brand color being used on multiple components, then you can start thinking about having a palette for the brand alone, going from like, if it's a blue, going from like a really light blue to a really dark blue. You don't have to, but it's just useful to know. If you look at really, really big applications, like you look at Spotify, they probably have multiple palettes for multiple colors, but we don't have to do that. Then naming is a challenge on itself. The sort of easiest way is just to give them, I call them primitive. I think the term that most people use is primitive values. So this is going to mean having a set of names going from like 0 to like 900. So 50 would be the lightest color, 900 would be the darkest color, and then just have everything in between. Another way to do things is have a more semantic approach to your colors. So have a color to the background, have a color to the foreground, to your copy, to your borders, whatever. Both of them they can become annoying in different ways. If you just use primitive values, it might become a little bit unclear to know, if I'm trying to color a border, should that be a 300 or 400? If I'm trying to do text, should that be 700 or 600? And then if you're using semantic colors, it might become really annoying when you have something like background text, because you're using black for the text and white for the background, but then you're in a component where it's flipped. So you're naming the background the color of the text. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. What I usually do is I layer them like onions. I have one layer that's going to be my primitive values and one layer that's going to be my semantic values. And if it makes sense to use the semantic ones, then you use them. If it doesn't make sense, you just need to get like the actual values, then you use them. You don't have to do any of that. You can just use your primitives or your semantics. It should be fine. So moving up in the layers, we have components. Components are quite easy to define. They're interactive building blocks for creating user interfaces, different from framework components. I'm not talking about the component that you get in React or you get in Vue. I'm talking about a visual UI component. So things like buttons, things like checkboxes, toggles, just small interactive things like that. These components are, again, going to make use of your design token. So if you have a button, it's going to have the color of the brand, and it's going to have the font, the typography of the brand, and whatnot. Going up, we have patterns. Patterns are tricky to define because I feel like if you're trying to create a design system, your tokens are quite obvious. We use these colors, we use these fonts. Components as well is like, well, we're surely going to have a button, but you don't really think of patterns; they just appear. If you're, for example, you're building a blog and you're going to need at some point to show information about an author. You're going to need the image of the author, like their picture. You're going to need their name. Maybe you're going to need the date that a blog post was posted. You're going to notice that this information is going to appear in multiple places. Rather than having it look differently, might as well just have the same thing. And then when you're building it, you're just going to need one component instead of multiple ones. Or like a contact, say that you have a contact form, say that you're building forms, and those forms appear in multiple parts of the website. If you can have that form be just one thing, one pattern, like a newsletter, like sign up to our newsletter, whatever, that's going to be a text box and a button. If that text box and button are going to appear multiple times, and just have it be its own thing. But they become obvious once you're building them. And then finally, if you're making any sort of marketing website, you are going to end up having blocks. I feel like if you're building product stuff, you're not really going to have blocks. You're going to have the sort of views themselves of, like this is a dashboard, or this is like a form for inputting some information. As I said, in the case of marketing websites, you are going to wind up having blocks. So blocks are going to be combinations of all the previous. You're usually going to use some sort of layout. Maybe you're going to use some sort of grid. And then those blocks are what you're going to be using to make up a page. So like a page, you can just divide it in multiple blocks. It sounds overwhelming. It sounds like a lot of information to take in. And again, if you get to like a big enough design system, then it can become really overwhelming. But you don't have to build this at once. As I said, it should be an iterative process. You shouldn't be creating your design system from scratch. It's going to appear as you build it. Initially, you're definitely going to need a few colors, a few fonts, as I said. And that should be that. Like, if that is it, that is it. You don't need to think of the tone of voice of your copywriting if you're not going to do anything copywriting-wise. You don't need to think about your animations if you're not going to do animations. But if you do, or when you do, then you can put them back into your design system. The whole point of this should be to make building things easier. If building a design system is gonna get in the way of you building the thing that you want to build, maybe it's not worth it. And And again, you look at huge design systems like the ones that Spotify or Material or Atlassian have, and they're really nice to look at, and they're impressive just to see how they've thought through so many different parts, but we don't have to do this at the moment. Just as long as you're thinking about that side, it should be good enough. Just sitting down for like an hour and just try to think of like the visual side of your app should just make things easier down the line. So, Tailwind. So Tailwind ended up being just perfect for the way that I build UIs. It's really interesting because I can see projects right before I started using Tailwind, and I was already subconsciously using some of these ideas, which is just cool to see because it's almost like you get your opinions validated by other people, which is nice. So what is Tailwind? Tailwind is a CSS framework. It's designed to make styling the web a lot easier. On the website, they're quite example sort of based, a utility-first CSS framework packed with classes like Flex, PT4, Text Center, and Rotate 90 that can be composed to build any design directly in your markup. So what does that mean? PT4 should be padding top 4, Text Center should just center the text, and Rotate 90 should just rotate an item 90 degrees. That's all it does. At the end of the day, Tailwind is just CSS code. I do see a lot of people sort of saying, oh, should I use Tailwind or should I use CSS? And it's like, Tailwind is CSS. There's nothing going on in the background, no magic, no JavaScript sort of being injected. It's just CSS. The way that I personally understanding, it's a collection of CSS utilities and a compiler to turn everything into your CSS. So the features that I care about for the purposes of design systems is that it's utility first. So a utility it's a CSS class with a single purpose. So it's one class, one purpose. It's just going to do one thing. Most of the time, a utility is going to be equivalent to one line of CSS. Sometimes it's going to be multiple lines. If you have, for example, text LG, that is usually going to be the size of the text and the line height. But most of the time, as I said, if you write flex, it's going to be display flex. It is mobile first, meaning that breakpoints work their way up. So you're going to end up, you're going to work with your sort of smaller resolution values first, and then the breakpoint is going to be, for example, MD is 768 pixels, going to be, so 768 pixels upwards. You're never going to work like laptop on the way down. It's going to be all the way up. This takes me to one sort of criticism I see quite often, which is the idea that Tailwind is just inline styles, which is something that you shouldn't really do. You shouldn't do inline styles, but I don't think you can do responsive on inline styles. I don't think you can do like, I don't think that you're going to be able to make styles based on other things. So breakpoints are one variant that you can apply styles to, but there's also things like, is the screen going to be a touch screen? If so, then apply this style. Is this going to be in dark mode? If so, make it this color. You can't do that on inline styles, but you can when you're using utilities. Another thing that I find really important is the config file, because Tailwind becomes customizable. You're not, see, if you go back to Bootstrap, you're kind of tied to the way that they do things, which sometimes can just get in the way. But if you're using a config file, you can essentially just tell Tailwind that this is your design system, this is what things are supposed to look like, and just work with that. And then finally, the compiler handles, different things. In general, it's in charge of generating your CSS classes based on the config and the utilities that you're sort of wanting to create. It's also going to handle vendor prefixing, so you no longer have to think of like, oh, this particular property doesn't work on macOS and you need to add this prefix. You don't have to worry about that. It's also going to handle minimizing. It's going to handle trimming and use styles. So if a style is not being used, they're just going to remove it from your final bundle, which is nice because it becomes quite performant without you really doing anything to make it performant. Yeah, and that would be it for Tailwind. So that's what it looks like. It's just a collection of classes. So there's 3 big reasons why you really like Tailwind, or not so much why you like Tailwind, but why it makes sense to me. So the first one is that this might be the one hot take in the talk, which is that I do believe that CSS utilities are the logical conclusion to CSS styling. Has anyone heard of carsonization? It's this thing where animals just keep evolving into crabs for whatever reason. It just seems like crabs are the ultimate animal shape. So you have multiple animals that just start looking like crabs over time, even though they're not crabs. I feel like utilities are the same thing. Oddly enough, they work really, really, really well. It is a bit of a double-edged sword, because then that's where lies the biggest criticism, which is when you're building with Tailwind, you're going to wind up with a markup that has like dozens and dozens and dozens of classes. It's like a wall of classes, which objectively, it does look a bit ugly. It doesn't look pleasant if you want to have your like nice aesthetic code on your editor. But there's a few reasons why I think they work really well. The first one is that you do tend to get stuff done a lot faster. As I said, when you're building stuff using the sort of traditional semantic CSS, you have multiple points that you need to pay attention to as you're building your UI. So you're going to have to look at your CSS, and you end up with this thing where it's like your CSS has the same structure as your HTML. You're going to have a big file with all your CSS classes, and even if you decide to start splitting your CSS into multiple files, what you end up having is 2 file structures that are doing the same thing. To me, it just gets in the way. It's a lot more productive if you can open your markup, and then you can see right there what the styling is supposed to be. It's more difficult to break things. I don't think I'm alone in having been through a situation where I update one CSS class, and I think, or I hope, it's not going to touch anything. And it doesn't look like it's doing anything, but then I notice a week later that it's actually broken this one component in a completely different area of the application or of the website. It's really, really annoying. By using utilities, your utilities are only affecting the one place where you're working on them, which means it's quite foolproof. You're never going to end up in that situation. Code becomes a lot more portable. You can essentially just copy and paste code from one project to another project, and it will work because utilities are not depending on any other files. They're just dependent on themselves. And this just opens the door to a lot of like UI libraries where it doesn't matter who your UI library of choice is. You're still going to be able to just copy and paste the code in. Again, it's quite performant because say you're building anything, or you're styling anything, and you're going to use display flex. You have the property, you have the property display, and then you're going to have the flex value. If you have 1,000 classes where you're using display flex, you're basically creating 1,000 instances of display flex. If you're using a utility, you have one instance of display flex, and you're going to have 1,000 places that it's going to be referring to that one. What that does on the long term, especially on big projects, is that instead of the size of your CSS growing even exponentially over time, is going to plateau, because you're eventually going to make use of all the utilities that you could possibly use, and sort of the CSS file just kind of like flattens a little bit, which is great because it means that it's not going to be growing over time. So it's quite performant, and as I said, it's going to trim down a lot of the unused styles. It's going to minimize them, so the performance of your CSS becomes a no problem at this point. And then the really cool thing, at least for me, is that you end up building a mental model where you just look at a component and you know exactly what's happening. So even if you're not looking at the browser, you can just say like, oh, okay, BG red, text white, whatever, P4, you end up having that it's almost like having a little compiler in your brain that knows what they're looking at. If you don't like Tailwind, because you just don't like how it works, there's other frameworks that do, other CSS frameworks that also do utilities. There's Tachyons is the kind of most popular one. There is Shed or Base that I haven't really used, but I've looked at what they do, and it's just the same idea. The second reason why I like it, why Tailwind to me makes sense is because your config, yes?
Little timer.
Okay, yeah. I'll try to be fast. Your config file becomes a built-in design system. So as I said, you're kind of defining your tokens, you're defining your components. When you get to your config file, you can literally just build your design system inside your config. It's it's an amazing way to bridge your design to your code. And just like utilities, you can use config to port them between projects, which is great. And you still have, so one thing that you could do if you really don't like utilities is you could still have Tailwind installed, not use any utilities at all, have your config file, and then on your CSS, you can still make reference to their values, to basically the utilities that are being generated, or the values that are being generated, which is, again, if you don't like utilities, you can still make use of the config file. And then the final one is the great defaults. Tailwind includes a lot by default. It's going to include colors, it's going to include spacing, shadows, border radiuses. There's a lot that you don't have to think about. You don't really need at that point to just consider, for example, shadows in your design system because they're already built in. But if you do have custom colors or custom fonts or whatever, the great thing is that it's going to take whatever your values are, your tokens are, and it's going to generate the utilities for you. So if you have a color, for example, it's going to generate a utility for the background, for the border, for the text color, for the stroke. If you're using SVGs, then it can do the filling as well, gradient, whatever. And then the final thing is component libraries. So component libraries are great. They do really speed up your process, just loads. There's loads of them to choose. You don't have to, you don't have to make a commitment to a single one. But they do have one issue. It's not an issue that should stop you from using them, but it's an issue to have in mind, which is going back to the issue with inconsistency. If you end up having like components from different libraries that have ever so slightly different styles, then that is a problem. I feel like this is just an advice that can be applied for Stack Overflow or can be applied to ChatGPT or even Copilot. If you just copy and paste code and you don't know what's going on, then you're not doing your job well, essentially. You should pay attention to the values that are being used and make sure that they match what it is that you're building or what it is that your branding is. And then finally, implementation and demo time. So all these ideas are great, but they're a bit abstract. So for this talk, I've built a little demo. The demo is in two parts. So one part is going to be the design system itself, which I'm going to show you in Figma, and then the other one is just a little project that I built in Next.js. It's inspired by a lot of the work that I was doing in marketing sort of oriented websites. But I feel like the ideas should still apply whether you're building a website or a product. I'm going to leave. I'll share on Discord links to, on Discord, I'll share links to both of them if you want to have a look. If not, you can just talk to me on Blue Sky and ask me for the link, and I'll be more than happy to share it. I will show all of these during the little demo, but I've used Figma for the design. You can use Sketch. You can use PenPot if you don't want to use Figma. I've used Next.js. Looking back, I feel like Astro would have been a better choice, but you can use Astro, you can use Nuxt. Hello. You can use Astro, you can use Nuxt, you can use Laravel, you can use anything you want. All these ideas are completely framework agnostic. You don't really have to do it in any way. I've tried to migrate Tailwind to I migrated Tailwind to V4, which came out a couple months ago, just to experiment what it would look like. It's actually been quite a lot of fun. And then some tools that are not obvious but are still very useful is the Tailwind IntelliSense and the Prettier plugin. So IntelliSense basically means you don't have to go to the docs anymore because you can just see what utilities are doing and you get auto predict almost. So as I said, you don't have to go to the docs anymore. And then the Prettier plugin is going to sort your classes and it's going to remove any like repeated classes. So that should be quite useful to use. I've also used CLSX and Tailwind and TW merge for condition and styling and for merging classes. So one issue that you might have is that there might, say that you're building a component and it has a set of styling like a button and the button is blue, but then you want your button to be purple. If you're passing a class to that component, there might be a bit of a conflict. If you use Tailwind merge, it will sort of say, okay, the one that I'm being passed has priority over the one that was already there, and it's going to remove the one that was already there. Then I've used the hero icon package for icons. I've used headless UI for unstyled interactive components. And then inline fold. So inline fold is a really useful one. If you really hate looking at utilities, inline fold is great because it just hides them. And then if you want to look at the utilities, you just click on them. But if you're just working on functionality or you just don't want to look at utilities, you can just have that enabled. So how do I do the next bit? That should be, yes.
No, sorry.
Okay. That should be if I just go here. There we go. Cool. So that's the little project that I've been doing just to show it as a demo. It's just a thing, as I said, it's going to be publicly available. You can just ask me for the link and I'll send it to you. But it's just a mini design system kind of built in. So the first thing that I could show would be, also let me just not show the grids. There we go. So the first thing to show would be the very basic tokens. So as I said, primitive values for your colors, and then have your semantic that just point to the primitive values, so that if I were to, this is actually going to look fun. If I were to decide that for whatever reason this should be red, it will just become red everywhere. That's kind of the point, isn't it? It's like if you need to update something, then you don't have to repeat it everywhere. But let's not do that just now. So yeah, colors. I do have a few just tokens for border radiuses. They're not super necessary, but you can just have them if you want to. Columns and then spacing for padding. At some point I had an issue with Figma because I was copying files and it just unlinked my variables from everything else. So you're not going to see that it's using a variable, but promise me, I did use them. But yeah, so as I said, when it comes to typography, having a bit of a scale, just from having a scale that makes sense, you're not going to have a heading 4 that is bigger than heading 3. But just having a little bit of a scale, making the choice of a couple fonts. So in this case, I've used Poppins and Inter. And then just having a few styles for body, for like regular weight, semi-weight, and bold weight. Then we have colors. So these colors, one of the things that I try to do is make sure that the colors are going to work with one another, just in terms of accessibility. I feel like that's a point that I haven't really talked about. But obviously, accessibility is important. You should make sure that the colors are going to be readable. Don't have a dark gray text on a black background because it's not going to be very readable, or don't have a light gray text on a white background. Don't do it. Because if your designs are accessible, they're going to be good designs just by themselves. Then again, I feel like, to me, logos are part of your design tokens because they're going to be used everywhere. A few icons, and then my spacing scale. And then I did use grids. I'm not going to talk about grids at the moment, but there are grids. Components, again, nothing too fancy because it's a sort of marketing website. Just a few buttons, checkboxes, radio buttons, text boxes, and drop-down menus. I do have patterns here. I'm not going to talk about patterns just now because I feel like it's just useful if I go straight to the blocks. So the blocks is, the blocks are what make up a page. If you look at your website, you're basically going to have blocks with different sorts of information. And then those blocks are just going to be made up of like, again, your design tokens, some components. And then over time, you're going to end up finding patterns. So like, for example, if we look at a card block where you have this piece where you have a heading, a copy, a bit of copy, and then two buttons, but then you look at list and it also has a heading, copy, and two buttons, and another one that also has heading, copy, and two buttons, I feel like that is a good enough reason to justify having a pattern, which I've called heading. Cards are another pattern if you know that you're going to have images with a little bit of text and a button or whatever, and they're going to be repeated in different places. Might as well just make them a pattern. One thing that you can do as well is if you have different styles for the same pattern, then you can just like, you can change them, and that sort of changes. Oh, did that actually work? And that changes your design, and it gives you a bit more. What is going on? I feel like can't really see anything. Oh, it's. I was only selecting this one. Sorry, but you can see that it's a different style. I'm gonna undo this one. There we go. Anyway, moving on. Things like, the newsletter that has a form that is repeated in multiple places, or the contact information, or a few icons for social media. So if you look at these icons for social media, they appear in the forms, they appear in the footer. You can include them as well in your Hero. It makes sense to have them as a pattern. Yes. So I'll just jump into the code base just now. I am being mindful of the time, I promise. Right, so they should be running. Cool, yeah. So again, I'm going to try to be really quick. So the first thing should be then going to your globals file. So again, this is the config file, and you can see here that I'm just saying these are going to be my fonts. This is going to be my primitive palette. These are going to be my. Sorry. Oh, absolutely, yeah. Is that looking a bit better? Great. And let me just, there we go. So I'm defining my fonts, I'm defining my colors, defining my semantic colors. Then I am trying to define a few options for the corner radius. So this is going to become useful if you're working across projects. Container sizes, a container, I'm not going to get into that just now, but just and a few utilities that are useful to have. Then we're going to have a look at the components. So for example, if we have a look at the button, this is where Tailwind merge and CLSX become useful, because if I have a component of a button and I want my button to look slightly different depending on where I'm using it or the style that I want to, then I can just take what should be the sort of base style, then choose, if I am using a solid outline or a button, then it should work in a different way. And then if I am in light or dark mode, then it should also look differently. I feel like there's nothing else. Yeah, and then just merge it with the rest of my styles, essentially. Again, going up, if we have a look at patterns, then you can have things like the cards, or things like, as I said, the social icon lists that are then going to be used throughout my blog. So if I have a look at my footer, and I have the footer here, and then I am using a pattern for the navigation items and a pattern for the footer bottom. Also, if I go to the navigation one, then I'm also making use of the navigation items in there. So again, it's just trying to make sure that the things that you're building can be reusable and you're not just repeating the same thing over and over again. If I have a look, so this is what it looks like. It's quite nice, pleasant to look at, whatever. But then to me, the really cool part is, say that I am working on a different project, and then it's for another company with another branding. I can do something like, if I go to my assets and I go to extra and I want this casual config file, and I just drop it in here and I save, and that should hopefully update it. There we go. So we can see that the font has changed, the corner has changed, the border radius has changed. Again, if this was another project, then I feel like from here is not too difficult to start sort of making a bit more custom. Again, if I wanted to use another design system, like another set of design tokens, can just drop them in. And now we have, there we go. Now we have a slightly different sort of neutrals and a different font, and now we have no border radiuses because, you know, it's a formal company, whatever. They don't want any rounded corners. So I feel like that should be the demo. I have left some resources. There is courses, some of them are free, some of them are paid. There's some books, just assets, fonts, icons, whatever you need, you can probably get it from there. As I said, I will share everything on the Discord. If you want to have a look, if you want to learn more about Tailwind or about design systems, anything, ask me, read these things. It's all there for free to look at. And I think that would be it. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Sorry for hassling you so much about time.
That's okay.
Such an interesting talk, such a whirlwind around like a really interesting library. Tailwind is so much fun because you can really just shoot from the hip. But it's nice to see the different ways in which you can sort of moderate those massive classes. And also I think it's really easy to take a design system for granted. So it's really interesting to see how that's built up from scratch and how it can be so adjustable. Like it's not set in stone, and then it is sort of iteratively built up.
Yeah, I feel like that should be, if there's one thing they're going to take from this talk is design systems are not, they shouldn't be the scary thing, and they should be set in stone. They are there to be changed if they need to be changed and expanded. And again, it should be an iterative process. It shouldn't be just like waterfall from design system to the implementation. But yeah.
Take away that, but also take away the cool fact about crabs.
Yeah, it's a really interesting phenomenon.
It's really cool.
But yeah, any questions?
I'll start back.
What's your take on using like Figma plugins for like and variables in order to like help accelerate that design process, that redlining process between design and development? Yeah, I was basically saying, right, how do you handle the redlining process between design and development, that handoff process between what the designers give you in terms of their variables and the constraints that Figma puts on them, and how you translate that into variables for the web?
So in my experience, because it's always been sort of me doing everything, I haven't really had to do a lot of that. There is one thing that I find fascinating is that there are plugins on Figma that just turn it into an API. Once you have that, all you need to do is just point it to the API so that it gives you the different tokens. I don't know if that answers your question at all. I haven't really had a look at that yet, but I will surely, love to use that in the future. Sorry.
Thank you. Okay, this is. I might get some of the terminology wrong, so just
fine.
forgive me, because I've just started using this Tailwind feature, and I think the one thing that I didn't really like about Tailwind was it's messy. It's like you get really big class names and all that stuff. So I started like using like in my global CSS file or my index CSS file the apply function. What's your thoughts on that? Because I'm really curious.
I have a bit of a love-hate story with apply. So apply is there to precisely solve the issue that you're pointing at. And it certainly does solve a lot, especially early on. If you have a button, I would like to have a button class that just gives me a button. But on the long term, it creates more issues than it solves, which is why it's almost like a philosophical stance where it's like you kind of need to trust the process and commit to using utilities. I'm not saying don't use apply, use it, but see as soon as you start having, like if you're using Sass especially, and you have like a button and then this button is affected by other things, see if you need to do that and you're still using apply, you should probably reconsider it. What you can do, as I said, an alternative to apply would just be to have your, for example, your button component have the different properties, your different CSS properties, and just use the values that Tailwind gives you. So if you're going to use the color, for example, on Tailwind v4, you can literally just do var and then color and the name of your color. So you're still making use of the features that Tailwind gives you without getting into the mess of having applies that are affected by other things. I think, if I remember correctly, I follow Adam Watham, the creator of Tailwind, on Twitter, and at some point he just opened up and said openly that the apply feature was a bit of a mistake. He made it so that the transition to Tailwind would be easier, and I think that is absolutely amazing. Again, continue using apply if it solves the problems that you're having, but it also kind of is like moving to sort of commit to utilities and then take a step back. So if you want to sort of fully commit and have an experiment and just try to really, really use the utilities, do so. If you still find that apply solves a lot of your issues, then definitely do so. I did use apply for things like typography, buttons and stuff like that, and they worked well until they didn't. And again, if it got to a point where I was using all these things that had apply on them, and then I added extra classes to undo the things that I was doing with the apply, and I feel like at that point it's just like, okay, what am I doing? Do I really need to use an apply for this, or can I just get all these classes and just put them on my markup? But yeah.
Yeah, no, that was a great answer. Thank you.
Some other people had their hands up.
Thank you. Thank you. Great talk. With the adoption of server components, is Tailwind future-proof? Does Tailwind compile on the server? I think it does, but it does. Someone's shaking their head. Safe. All right. Thank you.
I don't see why it wouldn't work with server components. At the end of the day, you're applying the styles. All these styles are going to be, generated, put on your CSS bundle, and that's what's going to be sent from the server. You're not really going to be generating any CSS classes once you're on the client. So, again, don't quote me on that, but I don't think server components should affect Tailwind in the future.
Hello.
Hi.
This doesn't technically fall within the bounds of your talk, but
yeah.
Tailwind has a lot of plugins. It has the typography plugin and a couple of other ones. And I've recently been using the typography plugin, and I have been really enjoying it with Markdown. And I'm just wondering if you've used any, if you have any thoughts on them.
Yeah, they're really cool. They're just a way to extend the functionality that Tailwind offers. So the typography plugin we used extensively when we went on block sections, because you could literally just, obviously you know how it works, but you have the prose class, and then you can start telling it, okay, in this prose, if you have an image, give it rounded corners, or if you have a link, make it this color. It's really, really, really useful. At some point we basically made our own plugins to handle different themes, which I obviously didn't include because it was just going to take for ages, but if you just ask me, I'll show you how they work. They're really cool. But yeah. Right.
Cool. Anybody else?
Thank you. Hi, that was a great talk.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just have a question. Because I totally went through the process you did designing with CSS, and then I naturally kind of evolved into this utility classes mindset kind of thing. So I'm completely with you. Yeah, it is. What I'm kind of been exploring is the idea of having the idea of the patterns are brilliant. So I'm thinking, is there a way to make those patterns a little bit? Do you turn those patterns into kind of components, predefined, where you can change a variable and? Yeah,
exactly.
Okay.
So those patterns are definitely there to be flexible and be customizable. The most simple example of this would be make them fit for dark mode. So if you think of do you know that thing that I showed that had a title, copy, and buttons? say that you have this pattern being used in a container that is dark, whereas the rest of the site is light, then it makes sense to just make it a bit customizable so that you can still use it in that context. Also, things like the one that is very, very customizable is the one that has the navigation items, because the navigation items, I'm just basically saying these are the links and this is the list of URLs that are going to be on the navigation, and that navigation is on desktop on the top nav, it is on mobile on the side card, and it's on the footer. The version in the desktop and the version in mobile, one is a row, the other one is a column. So I need to make it flexible so that they can adapt into different sort of contexts. So 100% make them customizable, make them flexible. But yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, really interesting talk. I'm sure that's going to spark a lot more conversations as we mingle around and have a bit more beer. So please feel free to take a seat. You've been stood up for ages and you've done a heroic effort. Grab a beer, definitely.
Yes.
4 bits of housekeeping. I was wrong when I said that wasn't that much. There'll be no meetup next month, spring break. And then starting in May, we're going to be moving to a new location over at BGSS, which is 15-minute walk up that direction, so super close by. That's number 1. Number 2, reminder, sign up through the QR code for a chance to win CTJS tickets at the end of April. Very fun, down in London. Thank you to Eagle Lab for pizza sponsorship and all their help getting this stuff up and running. Again, means a lot, super helpful. Thank you to our patron subscribers. Again, could be you, more posters that need to go up. And yeah, last but not least, more beers to be had, more pizza possibly. Go check it out. And we're going to be going to the pub as ever down at the Hootenanny. So we'll be moving over there, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes or something. But we'll round everyone up, and anyone who wants to join us do. It's usually a really good time. But see you in May.
Yes.
May.